The juvenile courtroom buzzed with activity that Tuesday morning. Wooden benches were filled with an assortment of people. Worried parents, exhausted social workers and anxious youngsters, all waiting for their cases to be called. Among them sat a small, thin boy named Marcus Thompson. He was different from the other kids in the courtroom. While the others fidgeted or whispered nervously, Marcus sat in the last row, a quiet figure, his worn-out blue backpack held tightly against his chest. His school uniform, though clean, was slightly too small for him, with sleeves that didn't quite reach his wrists. His shoes, scuffed and faded, seemed to echo the tiredness he carried, not just in his body but in his spirit. This wasn't Marcus's first time in this courtroom. In fact, it was his third appearance this year, all for the same offense, stealing food from Mr. Wilson's convenience store on Cedar Street. His first two appearances had resulted in nothing more than warnings and some community service hours. But today felt different. The crumpled piece of paper in his pocket felt heavy, like it carried the weight of his entire world. Every time he touched the paper, it was as though the burden of his life thus far was pressing down on him even harder. Marcus tried not to think too much about the letter in his pocket, but his mind kept drifting back to it. He had spent 3 long nights writing and rewriting it, carefully crafting his words. The paper was torn from his math notebook, its edges straightened with precision, yet the words on it held a power he didn't fully understand. As he sat there waiting for his case to be called, the letter felt like his last chance, his only hope. The court officer, Mr. Rodriguez, had been watching Marcus closely since the boy first walked into the courtroom. It wasn't unusual for a juvenile officer to keep an eye on the kids in the waiting area, but something about Marcus caught his attention. Maybe it was the dark circles under his eyes, or the way his hands trembled slightly whenever the judge called out a name. Mr. Rodriguez had seen many troubled kids come through these doors over the years, but there was something different about Marcus, something that made the officer uneasy. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he knew this was more than just another case of a troubled kid in need of a slap on the wrist. The judge, Sarah Martinez, sat at the front of the courtroom, reviewing each case file. Known for her strict yet fair approach, she had earned the nickname the Steel Judge over the years. Her silver hair was always neatly tied back, and her black robe was pressed to perfection. She was respected by many, feared by others. Her voice was strong and clear as she read off names and case numbers, a steady rhythm punctuated by the occasional interruption from her gavel. Marcus watched intently as various cases were called. He saw a teenage girl who had spray-painted school walls, a boy caught shoplifting expensive sneakers. Each time the judge spoke, her voice was authoritative and unyielding. She seemed to hold everyone in that room in her gaze, even the children who seemed so small and insignificant. Marcus couldn't help but wonder how she would look at him when his turn came. His social worker, Miss Thompson, no relation, sat a few rows ahead. She had been working with Marcus for several months now, ever since his first offense 6 months ago. She knew the boy's story better than anyone else in the room and she was concerned. Marcus didn't fit the typical mold of a troubled youth. He was quiet and polite, but there was a sadness in his eyes that spoke of a deeper pain. She looked back occasionally, checking on him, offering a silent reassurance. She could sense that today was different, but she wasn't sure how it would unfold. Finally, at 11:45 a.m., the court officer called out, "Case number 247, Marcus Thompson." The moment hung in the air. Marcus stood up slowly, his legs feeling weak. His hands were clammy, his heart pounding in his chest. Miss Thompson walked back to join him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Ready?" she whispered. He managed a small nod, though he didn't feel ready at all. Walking down the aisle to the defendant's table felt like wading through thick mud. Each step felt heavier than the last. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him, the court reporter, the bailiff, and especially Judge Martinez, who was now reviewing his file with a serious expression on her face. Marcus' fingers brushed the paper in his pocket once more, reassuring himself that it was still there. It felt like his only lifeline, but he wasn't sure what would happen when he handed it over. Would it make a difference? Would it change anything? As Marcus reached the defendant's table, he met the gaze of his public defender, Mr. James. He was a young lawyer with kind eyes and a slightly crooked tie. He had met with Marcus only once before, the day before the trial. They had talked briefly, but Marcus hadn't told him about the letter. He hadn't told anyone. It was something he needed to do himself, something he couldn't explain to anyone else. Not yet. Marcus' hand moved to his pocket one last time, making sure the paper was still there. He didn't know if he had the courage to do what he was planning to do. He didn't know if it would change anything at all. But he had run out of options, and this letter, this desperate cry for help, was all he had left. As Judge Martinez prepared to address Marcus's case, the court clerk handed her a thick file. The documents inside told the story of a young boy's life, marked by tragedy, but also by an unyielding resilience. The judge paused for a moment, her eyes scanning the papers. For a brief second, her expression softened as she read Marcus's story. It had all started 6 years ago on a rainy April evening. Marcus's parents, James and Lisa Thompson, were driving home from their late shift at the factory where they both worked. The roads were slick, the visibility poor, and the driver of a truck had fallen asleep at the wheel. The accident happened so quickly that neither James nor Lisa had time to react. Marcus, who was 6 years old at the time, was staying with his grandmother that night, what had been just a routine sleepover, but one that would ultimately save his life. The phone call had come at 3:27 a.m. Gloria Thompson, Marcus's grandmother, had received the devastating news that no parent should ever have to hear. In an instant, she became both the grieving mother and the new guardian of her young grandson. At 62 years old, Gloria had already retired from her job as a school cafeteria worker. Her life had been simple, supported by a modest pension and social security checks, but now it was filled with grief, responsibility, and the overwhelming task of raising Marcus. The first year after his parents' death, Marcus barely spoke. He would sit by the window of his grandmother's small apartment for hours, staring out at the street below, waiting for the cars that would never arrive. Gloria did everything she could to help him, using her limited resources to get him counseling through a community program. But no matter what she did, there was something missing in Marcus's eyes, a spark of hope that seemed to have died with his parents. The weight of that loss had followed Marcus all the way into the courtroom that morning, and now, standing in front of Judge Martinez, he felt like he was at the edge of everything. His past, his future, and the letter that might just be his last chance. Slowly, very slowly, Marcus Thompson began to smile again. It wasn't a broad smile, nor was it one that lit up his entire face, but it was a smile nonetheless, a small, tentative expression of hope. His life with his grandmother, Gloria, had settled into a rhythm, a kind of routine that gave them both comfort, even if only for brief moments. Gloria, despite her own struggles, always made sure that Marcus had everything he needed. Every morning she woke up early, her arthritic joints stiff and sore, but she pushed through the pain to make Marcus breakfast before school. She couldn't afford much, just simple things like oatmeal or the occasional scrambled egg, but she always made sure he had something in his stomach before heading off to class. Despite the hardships they faced, Marcus never complained. He knew what it meant to go without. Marcus understood their situation even at such a young age. He could see the way his grandmother would tighten her belt to make ends meet, how she sacrificed for him without ever asking for anything in return. He never said anything about having the same peanut butter sandwich for lunch every day because he knew it was all they could afford. It was just one more part of their life together, and while the routine was far from ideal, it was the life they had made for themselves. At school, Marcus showed promise. His teachers recognized his quick mind, especially when it came to mathematics and science. Mrs. Rodriguez, his fourth-grade teacher, often told Gloria that Marcus had the potential to go to college one day. In fifth grade, he won the school's science fair with a project on water filtration, inspired by the times their apartment's water would run brown, a constant reminder of their lack of resources. It was a small victory, but to Marcus, it felt like a step toward a better future. But things began to change about 8 months ago. Gloria's arthritis had worsened, making it more and more difficult for her to move around their third-floor walk-up apartment. The stairs, once manageable, became a painful obstacle that she had to climb each day. The medical bills started piling up, and their food stamps barely covered half the month. Gloria's pride kept her from asking for additional help, even though she could see how much they needed it. She would often skip meals, claiming she wasn't hungry just so Marcus could eat. Marcus noticed everything. He saw how his grandmother winced when she climbed the stairs. He saw how she counted pennies at the grocery store, trying to stretch every dollar. He noticed the way she wore the same worn sweater even in warm weather because she couldn't afford new clothes. The signs were there, but there was little Marcus could do to help. He started taking odd jobs around the neighborhood, offering to help neighbors with groceries or walk their dogs when he could, but the money was never enough. It wasn't long before he began stealing. The first time Marcus stole food, it was a package of bread and some cheese from Mr. Wilson's convenience store. He had watched his grandmother go for days without a proper meal, surviving on crackers as she claimed she was on a diet. But Marcus knew better. He saw the way she was struggling, how her health was deteriorating, and how proud she was of the little they had. The guilt Marcus felt when he saw his grandmother eating a proper sandwich for the first time in weeks was overwhelming, but it pushed the guilt of stealing aside. In that moment, it felt like the only thing he could do to help her. Social services had visited their apartment twice in the past year, responding to concerns about Marcus's declining school attendance. Both times, Gloria managed to convince them that everything was fine, that they were getting by. She was terrified that if they knew the truth, they would take Marcus away, separate them, and place him in foster care. Marcus shared that fear, which was why he never told anyone at school about their struggles. He didn't want to risk losing the only family he had left. Now, as Marcus sat in the courtroom for the third time, his story was laid bare in the documents before Judge Martinez. His straight A's from elementary school had dropped to C's and D's. His perfect attendance record had become sporadic at best. The reports from his previous court appearances showed a pattern. All his thefts were food items, always from the same store, always basic necessities. What the documents didn't show was how Marcus spent his evenings helping his grandmother up and down the stairs, how he learned to cook simple meals when she couldn't stand long enough to use the stove, or how he would read to her from his school books when her eyes were too tired to see the words clearly. The folder told a story of hardship, but it couldn't capture the depth of the bond between Marcus and his grandmother. It couldn't capture how they fought, day in and day out, to stay together in a world that seemed determined to pull them apart. Judge Martinez cleared her throat and looked directly at Marcus. "Marcus Thompson, please approach the bench," she said, her voice carrying through the now quiet courtroom. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed, and Marcus stood up slowly from his chair. His sneakers squeaked against the polished floor with each step he took toward the bench. The shoes were 2 sizes too big, a donation from the school's lost and found box after his old ones had completely fallen apart. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of the world was pressing down on his shoulders. Mr. James, his public defender, placed a gentle hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Remember what we discussed," he whispered. But Marcus hadn't told him about the note. He hadn't told anyone. It was something he needed to do himself, something he had written with his own hand, his own thoughts, his own plea. The courtroom was unusually full that morning. 2 police officers stood by the door, discussing something in hushed whispers. A group of law students sat in the back row, taking notes for their class. Mr. Wilson, the store owner, sat near the front, his arms crossed over his chest, a stern expression on his face. Even Mrs. Chin, from the apartment next door, had come to support Marcus. She had brought with her a character statement about how Marcus always helped her carry her groceries up the stairs, a small act of kindness that spoke volumes about the boy in front of the judge. Marcus reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the folded paper. The edges were soft now from being handled so many times, each crease a reminder of the 3 long nights he had spent writing and rewriting his thoughts. The note had been written in the hospital corridor, in the stillness of the night, while his grandmother slept in her room. The nurses had let him stay past visiting hours, pretending not to notice him huddled in the corner with his pencil and paper. "Your Honor," Marcus started, his voice barely a whisper. His throat was dry, his heart racing. He cleared his throat and tried again, louder this time. "Your Honor, I have something I need to give you." A murmur ran through the courtroom. This wasn't part of the plan. Mr. James looked surprised, his eyes wide as he glanced at Marcus. Miss Thompson, his social worker, leaned forward in her seat, her forehead creased with concern. Marcus took 3 more steps forward, his hand shaking as he pulled the folded paper from his pocket. Judge Martinez looked at the bailiff, who nodded slightly, indicating it was okay to accept the paper from the boy. The judge carefully unfolded the note, smoothing out the creases with her hand. The courtroom fell silent. Even the sound of the old radiator clicking in the corner seemed to fade into the background as everyone in the room waited, watching Marcus's face. At first, Judge Martinez's expression remained neutral, professional, just the way she had treated hundreds of other cases. But then something changed. Her eyes widened slightly as she read the note, and she adjusted her glasses, her fingers lingering on the paper. Marcus couldn't tell what she was thinking, but in that moment he hoped, just hoped, that his words, his story could finally make someone understand. Judge Martinez's reading glasses trembled slightly in her hand as she held Marcus's note, her fingers visibly shaking. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement, but to Marcus, it was like a seismic shift in the room. He had already felt his own hands trembling when he handed the note to her, but seeing the judge so visibly affected by his words sent a ripple of something like hope through him. The law students in the back of the courtroom stopped writing. Their pens paused in midair, frozen, as if they too sensed the change that was unfolding. Mr. Wilson, the store owner who had come to demand justice, uncrossed his arms, his tough exterior cracking. There was a noticeable shift in the air, a collective exhale, as everyone in the room seemed to understand that something unexpected was happening. Judge Martinez read the note a second time, then a third, each time more slowly, carefully, as though savoring the words. It was as though she was absorbing not just the details of Marcus's situation, but the raw emotion behind them. When she finally looked up at Marcus, her eyes were different. They were no longer those of a stern judge, detached from the people in her courtroom, enforcing the law without question. Instead, her gaze softened, filled with the kind of concern and understanding that a grandmother might feel for a child. The weight of the day's proceedings had lifted slightly from her face, replaced with something more compassionate, more human. Her voice caught as she spoke, a rare crack of emotion breaking through her professional demeanor. "Marcus," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper, "how long has your grandmother been in the hospital?" The question hung in the air, its simplicity only adding to the heaviness of the moment. Marcus swallowed hard, fighting back the tears that had threatened to spill since he handed her the note. He couldn't speak immediately. It felt as if the entire courtroom was waiting for him to give them an answer, and yet, in that silence, he couldn't summon the words at first. 8 days, Your Honor." Marcus's voice was small, barely above a whisper, but in the stillness of the room it was clear. He felt the weight of everyone's eyes on him. Police officers, law students, the social worker, and even Mr. Wilson, who had come in expecting to see a repeat offender punished for his wrongdoings, now looking at Marcus with a mix of sympathy and disbelief. "You've been living alone all this time?" Judge Martinez asked, her voice still gentle but tinged with disbelief. Marcus nodded, then quickly remembered the rules of the courtroom. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, a little louder this time. "I didn't know what else to do. If I told anyone—" His voice faltered and he couldn't finish the sentence, but everyone in the room understood what he meant. If Marcus had told anyone the truth, if he had admitted that his grandmother was in the hospital and he was home alone, social services would have taken him away, put him into the foster system, and separated him from the only family he had left. It was a reality he was terrified to face. The system was not built to keep families together, and Marcus knew that better than anyone. Judge Martinez set the note down on her desk and removed her glasses, something she only did in moments of deep contemplation. Then she did something that shocked everyone in the courtroom. It was a moment that would be discussed for years to come, a moment that would change not just Marcus's life, but the lives of many children who would find themselves in similar situations. Judge Martinez turned to face the entire courtroom, still holding Marcus's note in her hand. What she was about to do went against standard court procedure. It wasn't normal for a judge to read aloud a defendant's personal plea, especially in a case like this, but something about Marcus's story, his raw honesty, and his desperation made it impossible for her to simply follow the rules. With the court's permission, she began, her voice steady but softer now than before. "I would like to read this note aloud." She paused for a moment and looked at Marcus, silently asking for his consent. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. His shoulders were hunched, and he looked as though he were trying to make himself as small as possible, as though if he could disappear, he would. He didn't want to be the center of attention, but this was his only chance to speak his truth, to have someone finally understand the impossible situation he had been living in. The judge began to read Marcus's note aloud. "Dear Judge Martinez, I know I'm in trouble again. I know stealing is wrong. My parents taught me that before they died, and my grandmother reminds me every day to be honest. But I don't know what else to do anymore. My grandmother, she's all I have. 8 days ago she collapsed in our kitchen. Her arthritis got so bad she couldn't even hold a glass of water. I called 911 just like she taught me to do in emergencies. They took her to City General Hospital. The doctors say she needs surgery on her hands and special medicine that costs more money than we have. She's been there for 8 days now. I've been visiting her every evening after school, but I have to pretend everything is okay at home. I couldn't tell anyone I was alone because they would take me away from her. I know how the system works. I hear the other kids talk about it at school. Once you're in foster care, it's hard to stay with your family. My grandmother is my only family. I can't lose her too. The food stamps ran out last week. I tried to make the food last, but it wasn't enough. Mr. Wilson's store is the only one I can walk to. I know it's wrong to steal, but I was so hungry I couldn't focus in school. My head hurt all the time. I'm not asking you to let me go. I know I did wrong. But please, please help me find a way to stay with my grandmother. She's not just my guardian, she's my best friend. She reads me stories even when her eyes hurt. She helps me with homework even when her hands are in pain. She tries to hide when she cries at night, but I hear her worrying about bills. I'm good at math, Your Honor. I can get a job when I'm old enough. I'll pay back everything I stole. I'll do community service. I'll do anything. Just please don't separate us. Respectfully, Marcus Thompson. As Judge Martinez finished reading the note aloud, the courtroom remained silent. The words had settled in the room, a heavy truth hanging in the air. Mr. Wilson, who had come to demand justice for his stolen goods, was wiping his eyes with a handkerchief. The law students who had been dutifully taking notes were now frozen, their pens hovering over their notebooks, caught in the emotion of the moment. Even the usually stoic bailiff couldn't hide his reaction. He was looking down at his shoes, trying to conceal the emotion that had crept into his face. Miss Thompson, Marcus's social worker, had moved closer to him, her eyes softening as she absorbed the raw honesty of the note. Her case files showed dozens of similar situations. Children in desperate circumstances, families hanging by a thread, but something about this one was different. The sheer honesty, the desperate attempt by a 12-year-old to keep his family together, moved everyone in the room. Mr. James, Marcus's public defender, stood straighter now. His usual calm demeanor had shifted as he realized that this case was no longer just about a child caught stealing. It had become something much more complex, something that blurred the lines between right and wrong, survival and crime. It was a story of love, of survival, and of a child who had been forced to make impossible choices just to keep the one person who truly cared for him in the world. Judge Martinez carefully folded the note and placed it in Marcus's file, looking at the boy standing before her, seeing him truly for the first time, not as a repeat offender, not as another case number, but as a child trying desperately to hold his world together with whatever means he could find. The silence in the courtroom grew heavier with each passing second. Everyone was waiting for the judge's response. Would she follow standard procedure, sending Marcus into the foster system while his grandmother recovered? Or would she understand that sometimes justice needed to wear a different face? Marcus stood there, his heart pounding in his chest, louder than he had ever felt it before. He had told his truth, he had laid bare his desperate situation, and now, all he could do was wait. Wait and hope that someone, anyone, would finally understand. Finally, Judge Martinez removed her black-rimmed glasses and placed them carefully on her desk. Her voice was firm but gentle when she spoke. "Court will take a 30-minute recess," she announced. "Marcus, would you please join me in my chambers? Mr. James, Miss Thompson, please accompany us." The room was still, each person caught between anticipation and disbelief. What would happen next? No one could have predicted what Judge Martinez was about to do. Judge Martinez turned to the bailiff, her voice calm but decisive. "Thompson will come with us," she said. "Please call City General Hospital. I need to speak with the doctor treating Gloria Thompson." A murmur of surprise rippled through the courtroom as Marcus stood, still shaken, and followed the judge out of the room. This wasn't typical. Judges didn't normally invite defendants into their private chambers, especially not in juvenile cases. But everything about Marcus's case had been different from the moment he had stepped into the courtroom. As Marcus followed Judge Martinez, he couldn't help but feel a mix of confusion and curiosity. He had expected the judge's chambers to be cold, sterile, even intimidating. But as the door swung open, he was met with something entirely unexpected: a warm, inviting room. It was cozy and comfortable, with brown leather chairs scattered around the space. Photographs of children adorned the walls, some smiling happily, others caught in more serious moments. These, Marcus would later learn, were not just pictures of any children. They were images of kids Judge Martinez had helped over the years. Children who had turned their lives around, who had been given a chance when they were at their lowest. This room, filled with reminders of her past successes, was a stark contrast to the cold, impersonal courtroom he had just left. "Sit down, Marcus," Judge Martinez said, gesturing to a comfortable chair in front of her desk. Her voice was no longer the stern, authoritative tone it had been in court, but rather soft and kind. She didn't sit behind her desk as most judges would, but instead chose a chair right next to him, lowering herself to his level. It felt personal, as though she wanted him to feel safe and comfortable in that moment. "Would you like some water? Maybe a sandwich?" she asked. "I always keep extra lunch in my mini fridge for long court days." Marcus's stomach growled at the mention of food, a loud reminder of how long it had been since he had last eaten properly. He didn't have the words to respond immediately, but his body did the talking for him. His eyes flickered toward the fridge. The judge didn't wait for him to answer. She simply rose from her seat and walked over to her small refrigerator. She pulled out a turkey sandwich, an apple, and a bottle of water. She set the food down in front of him, a simple, kind gesture that made him feel cared for, something he hadn't experienced in a long time. He hadn't realized how hungry he was until he saw the food, and with the first bite, he felt his body begin to relax just a little. While Marcus ate, Judge Martinez picked up her phone and put it on speaker. "This is Dr. Roberts from City General," a crackling voice came through the speaker. "I'm treating Gloria Thompson." The judge didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Doctor, how is Mrs. Thompson doing?" she asked, her voice steady and professional. The doctor's voice came through again, tinged with concern. "She needs surgery on both hands. The arthritis has gotten severe. We can help with the surgery, but the bigger problem is that she's worried sick about her grandson. Her blood pressure keeps spiking because of the stress." Miss Thompson, the social worker, had been listening intently and opened her notebook, ready to offer suggestions. "Your Honor, I can arrange for temporary foster care while—" Judge Martinez interrupted firmly, her tone leaving no room for debate. "That's not the solution here," she said, her eyes softening as she turned back to Marcus. He was halfway through the sandwich now but was clutching the other half tightly in his hands, almost protectively as if afraid someone might take it away. "Marcus," Judge Martinez said suddenly, catching his attention. "Do you know where I live?" Marcus blinked, confused by the question. "No, Your Honor," he replied hesitantly. "I live 3 blocks from City General Hospital," she said. "In the blue house with the big porch. My children are grown and moved away, and I have 2 empty bedrooms and a refrigerator that's always full." She leaned forward, her eyes kind but earnest. "Would you be willing to stay with me until your grandmother gets better?" For a moment Marcus didn't know how to respond. His eyes widened in disbelief, and the sandwich slipped from his hands, landing on his lap. He didn't know if it was the shock of what she was offering or the pure kindness of it, but tears sprang to his eyes, unbidden. He had never imagined that someone would offer him such a thing, not a judge, not anyone. Mr. James, Marcus's public defender, sat up straighter, clearly taken aback. "Your Honor, is that allowed?" he asked, his voice filled with surprise. Judge Martinez smiled softly, her eyes twinkling with a mix of mischief and confidence. "I'm not just a judge, Mr. James," she said. "I'm also a certified foster parent. I've taken emergency cases before." She turned back to Marcus, her expression gentle but firm. "This way you can visit your grandmother every day. You'll have proper meals, a safe place to sleep, and you won't have to worry about being separated from her." The tears that had been threatening to fall from Marcus's eyes now spilled over. He couldn't believe it. This judge, who had been so stern and unyielding in court, was now offering him a home, a safe haven, when he had felt like the whole world was closing in on him. It was too much to process all at once. Miss Thompson had already moved into action, making calls on her cell phone, setting the wheels in motion. As for the legal charges, Judge Martinez continued, her voice becoming more official, as though she were resuming her judicial role. "You'll do community service at Mr. Wilson's store," she explained, referring to the store owner whose goods Marcus had stolen. "You'll help him stock shelves and clean up for 2 hours after school, 3 days a week until you've worked off what you took. Does that sound fair?" Marcus nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. The weight of everything, the fear of losing his grandmother, the shame of stealing, the terror of being separated from her, was suddenly alleviated. He had a place to stay. He had someone who cared. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt like he could breathe. "One more thing," Judge Martinez added, reaching for her phone again. "Hello, Mr. Wilson?" "Yes, this is Judge Martinez. I need to set up a store account for the Thompson family." "Yes, for food and necessities. Bill it to me directly." By the time Marcus returned to the courtroom 20 minutes later, everything had changed. The judge had not only found a way to keep Marcus out of the foster system, but she had also created a bridge to help his family cross their difficult time. The law students, who had been watching the case unfold with fascination, now witnessed something entirely unexpected. Judge Martinez, once a stern figure in a black robe, had transformed into someone who had acted with compassion, someone who understood that sometimes justice required more than just following the law. She had acted as a mother, a mentor, and a protector all in one moment. News of Judge Martinez's decision spread quickly throughout the courthouse and beyond. By the next morning, something unexpected started happening in their small city. People began reaching out, wanting to help the Thompson family in any way they could. Mr. Wilson, the store owner who had pressed charges against Marcus, was the first to act. He removed all the theft complaints he had filed and transformed his small convenience store into a community support center. He placed a donation jar on the counter with a photo of Marcus and his grandmother, and within 3 days, it was overflowing with bills and change. "I've been in business here for 30 years, Mr. Wilson told a local newspaper. "I've seen kids steal before, but I've never seen one steal only bread and cheese for his sick grandmother. We need to do better as a community." At City General Hospital, the medical staff was equally moved by the story. Dr. Roberts, who had been treating Gloria Thompson, gathered a team of specialists who agreed to perform her surgery at a reduced cost. The hospital's social services department helped arrange a payment plan for the remaining bills that the family could actually afford. Marcus's school principal, Mrs. Anderson, called an emergency staff meeting. "One of our students was starving and we didn't know," she said, her voice shaking. "This cannot happen again." By the end of the week, the school had started a new program called the Thompson Food Pantry, where families in need could quietly take what they needed, no questions asked. Living with Judge Martinez turned out to be exactly what Marcus needed. Her blue house, with its big porch and comfortable chairs, became a place of refuge. Every evening they sat together and she helped him catch up on his homework. For the first time in months, Marcus felt safe, cared for, and supported. He had a family again, one that wasn't defined by blood but by love and compassion. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where hope had replaced despair. 6 months had passed since that life-changing day in court, and the transformation in both Marcus and his grandmother, Gloria Thompson, was nothing short of extraordinary. It was early in the morning, and the sun was streaming through the windows of City General Hospital as Marcus carefully helped his grandmother pack her bags. After successful surgery and months of rehabilitation, Gloria was finally ready to go home. "Are you sure you've got everything, Grandma?" Marcus asked gently, folding a new robe into her bag. The robe was a gift from the hospital staff, who had grown fond of Gloria's gentle spirit and her determination throughout her long stay. Gloria, now with fully healed hands thanks to the surgery, flexed her fingers and smiled at Marcus. The surgery had restored her ability to perform simple tasks that most people took for granted, things she had been unable to do for years due to the severity of her arthritis. Marcus stood back for a moment, watching his grandmother. He noticed how different she looked now, how much stronger she was. The months of worry and stress had faded from her face, replaced by a calm happiness. In the months since her surgery, Marcus had also undergone a transformation. Gone was the thin, scared boy who had trembled in court. In his place was a confident young man. He stood tall, wearing a clean school uniform and proudly sporting an honor roll pin on the collar. His backpack, which had once been filled only with books, now also contained his latest math competition trophy. The improvement in his life had been nothing short of miraculous, and he owed it all to the unexpected kindness and support of the community, and particularly to Judge Martinez. As Marcus helped his grandmother finish packing, there was a knock at the door. It was Judge Martinez, car keys in hand, ready to drive them home. She had made it a point to take Marcus to visit his grandmother every single day during the past 6 months while Gloria had been in the hospital. She had become more than just a judge to Marcus. She had become a mentor, a protector, and even a friend. Marcus had learned so much from her over the past months, not just about the law but also about compassion, patience, and how to face life's challenges with grace. "The apartment's all ready," Judge Martinez said warmly, smiling as she stepped into the room. "Mrs. Chen made sure everything is perfect." What she didn't mention was how the entire community had come together to help renovate the Thompson family's home. The home had been a small, modest apartment, but now, thanks to the efforts of their neighbors and local businesses, it had been completely transformed. New furniture, fresh paint, and a working elevator had been provided by people whose hearts had been touched by Marcus and his grandmother's story. Marcus was still processing the magnitude of what had happened in their lives. It was hard to believe that just a few months ago he had been facing juvenile charges, worried about where he would live and whether his grandmother would survive. Now he was helping to organize food drives for the Thompson Food Pantry, which had grown to serve over 50 families. He was part of a community that cared about him and his family, and he was learning how to give back in ways he had never imagined. As Marcus loaded the last of the bags into the car, Judge Martinez pulled him aside. She handed him a small envelope, her eyes filled with pride. "This is for you," she said. "It's a college fund. Mr. Wilson, the store owner, and several other people from the community have contributed. For your future. Use it wisely." Marcus's eyes widened. He had never expected anything like this. Just a few months ago he hadn't known if he would even finish high school, let alone go to college. Now, not only was he on the path to graduating, but he had a real shot at higher education. The money from the fund wasn't a handout, It was a gift from a community that believed in him, that saw the potential in him that he had never seen in himself. At Mr. Wilson's store, where Marcus still worked after school, the donation jar had been replaced with a college fund jar. Regular customers now added $1 or $2 to the jar with each purchase, all going toward Marcus's future education. It was another example of how the community had rallied behind Marcus and his family. What had started as a small act of kindness had now grown into a network of support that would last for years to come. Mr. Wilson had also taken Marcus under his wing. He had started teaching Marcus about business management and entrepreneurship, seeing potential in the boy's quick mind and strong work ethic. Marcus had always been good with numbers, and Mr. Wilson was helping him hone that skill, guiding him to think about how he could someday run his own store. Marcus's story had also started to change the way the juvenile court system operated in their city. After witnessing the incredible turnaround in Marcus's life, Judge Martinez had established new protocols for handling cases involving minors. The new protocols required thorough family assessments before making any decisions, ensuring that the root causes of juvenile offenses were understood before legal consequences were handed down. This new approach, known as the Martinez method, focused not just on punishing the actions of minors but on understanding and addressing the circumstances that led them to those actions. Over time, the Martinez method gained recognition, and other judges from around the state began calling Judge Martinez to learn more about her approach. Some had been skeptical at first, but they soon saw the positive impact it had on the families involved. Judge Martinez was transforming the way juvenile justice was handled, proving that sometimes the best way to serve justice wasn't by following the letter of the law, but by seeing the humanity in those who stood before her. At school, Marcus had become something of a quiet leader. His academic performance had skyrocketed, especially in math, where he had earned a spot in advanced classes. His teachers had even begun discussing college scholarships for him, something Marcus had never thought possible. He was no longer the shy, withdrawn kid who barely made it through each day. He was now a young man with a clear sense of purpose and a bright future ahead of him. Marcus still helped Mrs. Chen with her groceries, but now he wasn't alone. Other kids from their building had joined him, creating a schedule to help all the elderly residents. They worked together as a team, and Marcus had become a natural leader, teaching others the importance of helping those in need. One of his classmates explained, "Marcus taught us that helping others isn't just nice, it's necessary." Meanwhile, the Thompson Food Pantry, which Marcus had helped organize, had grown to serve over 50 families in the community. The pantry was stocked through food drives and donations, and Marcus played a key role in ensuring it ran smoothly. It had become a lifeline for many families in the area, and Marcus was proud to be part of it. As Marcus and Gloria left the hospital, there was a sense of finality to the journey they had been on. They were leaving behind the uncertainty and hardship of the past and stepping into a future full of possibility. The community that had supported them was still there, and it had become a place where people helped one another, where compassion and care were not just nice ideas but the foundation of a stronger, more united society. Walking out into the fresh spring air, Marcus helped his grandmother into Judge Martinez's car, his heart swelling with gratitude. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of challenges, but they had also been a journey of growth, of healing, and of transformation. For the first time in a long time, Marcus felt confident that he and his grandmother had a real future, one filled with hope and possibility. And he knew no matter what happened next, he would never forget the kindness that had changed their lives. As the car drove through familiar streets, Gloria Thompson looked out the window, her heart filled with gratitude. "I used to pray for a miracle to help us," she said, her voice soft yet full of emotion. "I never expected it would come in the form of a stolen loaf of bread and a handwritten note." Marcus, sitting next to her, reached over and gently took her hand. He could feel the smoothness of her skin, so different from the swollen joints he had once known. It was a change that mirrored their entire journey. He squeezed her hand and smiled. "Sometimes miracles look different than we expect," he said, repeating words Judge Martinez had often shared with him during their many chess games. The car turned onto their street, where a crowd of neighbors had gathered to welcome them home. At the front of the crowd stood Mrs. Chen, holding her famous dumplings, a dish she had shared with the family many times during their time of struggle. Mr. Wilson, the store owner who had once pressed charges against Marcus, had closed his store early to be there. Even Marcus's teachers had come, all of them eager to celebrate this moment. This wasn't just a homecoming, it was a living testament to how one act of desperation, met with understanding instead of judgment, could transform not only a single family but an entire community. It had been a year since Marcus had handed that desperate note to Judge Martinez. Today he found himself standing in the same courtroom, but everything had changed. The room was packed, not for a trial but for the first annual Youth Support Conference, and Marcus was the keynote speaker. Wearing a crisp blue shirt and tie, something Judge Martinez had helped him pick out, he approached the podium with a newfound confidence. As he looked out over the crowd, Marcus saw so many familiar faces. His grandmother sat in the front row, her hands now strong enough to clap loudly, a proud smile on her face. Next to her was Mr. Wilson, still the same store owner but now a friend and supporter. Mrs. Chen had brought her whole family, and even Dr. Roberts, who had been so instrumental in Gloria's recovery, had taken time off from the hospital to attend. It was a moment of unity and triumph, one that no one could have predicted when Marcus first came to court with his broken heart and desperate hope. Marcus cleared his throat and began. "A year ago I stood in this exact spot," he said, his voice steady and clear. "I was terrified and hungry, holding a note that I thought was my last hope." He paused, glancing over at Judge Martinez, who was sitting on the bench, her smile warm and encouraging. "I didn't know then that it wasn't my last hope. It was my first step toward a new life." The audience sat in rapt attention as Marcus shared his story. He spoke of the nights he had gone hungry, of watching his grandmother struggle with the debilitating pain of arthritis, and of the overwhelming fear of being separated from her. But he also spoke of what happened after, how the community had come together, how second chances had been given, and how one person's compassion had made all the difference. Today, Marcus was proud to announce that the Martinez Youth Support Program was becoming official. He revealed that Judge Martinez had worked with the City Council to create a program that would provide struggling families with the resources they needed before they reached a crisis point. The program would include food assistance, medical care, educational support, and emergency housing. But most importantly, it would focus on keeping families together while helping them overcome their challenges. Mr. Wilson stood up next to speak. "We now have 20 stores across the city participating in the community care program," he said proudly. "No child in our city should have to steal food to survive." The Thompson Food Pantry, which had started as a small initiative, had expanded to serve every school in the district. Mrs. Anderson, Marcus's old principal, shared how the program had helped over 500 families in the past year. "And it all started because one brave boy showed us what real need looks like," she said, smiling at Marcus, her words filled with admiration. Gloria Thompson's story had inspired more than just the youth support program. Dr. Roberts spoke about how the hospital had created a special program for elderly patients, ensuring they received proper care and support at home. "Mrs. Thompson taught us that medical care isn't just about treating the body," he said. "It's about healing the whole family." Meanwhile, Marcus's own transformation had earned him early acceptance to several colleges, with full scholarships waiting. But what made him most proud wasn't his academic success, it was the difference he had made in the lives of other kids. Marcus had started a mentoring program at his school, showing other students that asking for help wasn't a sign of weakness, but a sign of strength. It was a message he wished he had known earlier in his life, and now he was passing it on to others. Judge Martinez took the podium last. "1 year ago, a young boy taught me that justice without compassion isn't justice at all," she began, her voice filled with emotion. "Today we're not just celebrating Marcus's success story. We're creating a system to make sure his story becomes the norm, not the exception." As the conference drew to a close, people gathered around Marcus and his grandmother. Mrs. Chen brought her famous dumplings, which were passed around, and Mr. Wilson handed out treats from his store. The law students who had witnessed Marcus's original court case, now newly graduated lawyers, spoke excitedly about implementing similar programs in other cities. It was clear that the ripple effect of Marcus's story was just beginning, and it was inspiring others to take action and make a difference in their own communities. Later that evening, Marcus and Judge Martinez sat on her porch, just as they had done so many times before, ready for their regular chess game. Judge Martinez moved her knight and looked over at Marcus, her expression thoughtful. "Did you ever imagine," she asked, "that your note would change so many lives?" Marcus studied the chessboard carefully before making his move. He thought about all that had happened, the struggles, the kindness, the people who had come together to support him and his grandmother. He thought about how far he had come and how much he had learned. "No," he answered honestly. "I was just trying to save my family. But now I understand that sometimes saving yourself means helping others too." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, the sound of children laughing drifted through the air from down the street. In Mr. Wilson's store, another family was receiving the help they so desperately needed. In the hospital, Another elderly patient was being treated with the same care and respect that Gloria had received. And on that porch, a boy who had once felt hopeless played chess with the judge who had changed his life. Both of them knew that this wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning of something much bigger.